Welcome. My name is Stephanie Heptum, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And I'm also a co-editor of Conceptualizations of Blackness in Educational Research. The questions that ground this edited volume are: what theories of Blackness inform educational research, and what are the aspects that are important in research with young people? Who are the teachers, and what are the lived experiences that guide how researchers learn how to theorize about Blackness? And what do researchers wish they could see more scholars do in the field of education? Of course, the goal of this volume is not to arrive at a common understanding of Blackness or a universalized theory that can be applied in educational research with Black youth. The goal is to demonstrate an array of theorizations, tensions, possibilities, and their effect upon research dedicated to reducing inequality in the lives of young people. The authors with me today have written chapters paired together in a section called Illuminating ImPossibilities. They meditate on how Blackness is embraced and or disappeared in educational spaces, popular culture, and literature. In doing so, the authors shed light on creative and alternative Black theories and stories to intervene on limits that they identify. I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Brian Lozensky and Sean Cameron Golden to introduce and read from their chapters in the volume. After both authors have shared, we'll have some time for a few discussion questions. We'll begin with Dr. Brian Lozensky. Brian is an associate professor of urban and multicultural education and the chair of the Educational Studies Department at Macalester College. He is also a board member of the Education for Liberation Network. Brian, can you please get us started?
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Safana, and thank you to everyone from William T. Grant and the folks who have been putting this volume together. It's been an honor to be part of this. And so, you know, my chapter and my contribution, it comes out of, it comes out of several places. One being the work that I've done over the past decade or so with Black youth, specifically in the realm of youth participatory action research. It's a reflection and a meditation on how Blackness as an identity, as an individual identity, in my mind is, and from the readings that I'm trying to bring together and synthesize, a limiting approach to how we should understand processes and functions of race and racialization. And I draw from scholars like Denise Ferreira da Silva and Achille Mbembe to offer a reconceptualization of Blackness as an insurgent process rather than a personal identity. And so the chapter works from my days doing youth participatory action research with young people into the realm of racial theory, and then trying to come to some kind of sense making around what this process of insurgency might be able to help us do moving forward. So that's kind of the spiel around like where my piece came from and where my thinking's been lately. Safana, should I just go straight in and start to read? So I'm gonna read kind of past the introduction and more into some of the kind of theoretical framings that I'm using to hopefully get people a sense of what my chapter is about. So first, my chapter is called "I've Been Down So Long It Looked Like Up to Me: The Practice of Racial Formation as Overthrow." And of course, the opening quote from that comes from the song "Fake Love" from the hip hop artist Drake. So I'll jump in. In this essay, I respond to what I describe as Blackatalist enactments by emphasizing how Blackness as identity reifies racialist logics, perpetuating a fantasy of racial equality, an oxymoronic notion that misunderstands the very workings of race and racialism. Blackitalism is not simply Black capitalism or a reference to people to whom Blackness has been ascribed engaging in capital accumulation. It is a troubling amalgam of coloniality and derivative capital accumulation through the commodification of racial identity. A 21st century invention where the psychology of racial identity is translated into psychosocial and economic capital. In calls for equality, race is framed as a benign social construct where a racially plural populace lives together in harmony, ignoring the fact that race was historically conceptualized as an abstract representation of power dynamics that were only ever meant to justify and rationalize already existing social inequalities through subjugation. Racialism, the ontological precursor to racism, is the belief that racial categories actually reflect legitimate natural distinctions in human populations. Situating my analysis in the negative space of racial theory, I respond to the call from artist and racial theorist Denise Ferreira da Silva to shine an analytic black light on our social political worlds. Ferreira da Silva suggests that an analytical black light allows for reinterpretation of taken for granted notions of separability, determinacy, and sequentiality, where racialism thrives, allowing for the production of human and non-human categories, teleological renderings of resistance and progress, and clean narratives of liberation as a destination rather than a social political practice. The negative space is where the unspoken, the taken for granted, and subterranean elements of racial theory make common analyses more prominent and bold. Black light makes these negative spaces evident, providing interventions and common understandings of race, racism, racialism, whiteness, and my emphasis in this chapter, Blackness. I explicate how Black light as methodology provides a generative pathway to disrupt the colonial academy, opening up new ways to see the human constructed worlds of the past and present. Methodologically, I juxtapose signification, a core technology of semiotics, and signifying, a Black rhetorical practice of subterfuge, in order to critique Black identity as a socio-political formation that relies on colonial subjectivity. I explore the problematic nature of Black as a floating signifier and instead assert Blackness as a process holding insurgent power. Drawing from an etymological and phenomenological and historical tracing, racial theorist Achille Mbembe asserts that, quote unquote, Black has served three functions in modernity, those of summoning, internalization, and reversal. Mbembe suggests that Blackness is initially summoned to represent power relations of coloniality and enslavement, and continues to be summoned through the ongoing processes of racialization, i.e., you are Black, I am white. After the summoning, those who have been dispossessed of land, labor, and humanity might take up Blackness as an internalized capacity. Think James Brown, I'm Black and I'm proud. Finally, Mbembe argues that the internalized capacity of Blackness should be reconfigured into a source of power to reverse or abolish the social arrangements, i.e. the abolition of race and the social hierarchies that necessitate it. Blackitalism, which is, and I referenced this earlier in the piece, is a parenthetical to the 1990s hip hop group Diggable Planet's song, Ninth Wonder. So the idea of Blackitalism, I'll jump back in, is an interesting merging of three concepts: Blackness, capital with an O, and capitalism. The spelling of Blackitalism, Blackitolism, with an O as opposed to an A, signals a geopolitical component to the title that extends beyond Black capitalism. I have to think that Diggable Planets made the spelling intentionally. It fits with the song's celebration of Brooklyn as the capital of Blackness. Of course, we'll just maybe look past the gentrification of the last quarter century. The Blackital as a political symbol would represent the metropole governing Blackness. Adding the ism to the Blackital interestingly turns the metropole into a relational system. The Blackital now has an economic philosophy of capitalism based on the production and uneven accumulation of capital. The Blackital is now in the business of governing capital accumulation through the commodification of Blackness, a literal enactment of racial capitalism. I don't think this was Diggable Planet's intention, but it provides a powerfully illustrative metaphor for how Blackness and racialization have become cognitively disassociated from their historical origins. A semiotic analysis shows how Blackness as a benign social identity enables this disassociation, where the effects of racialization can be seen in many cases as positive. As the hip hop artist Drake opines in the song Fake Love, I've been down so long it looks like up to me. This sentiment captures the mythology of Blackness as a social identity that for many has become a source of cultural signification, meaning making, and yet problematically capital accumulation. Blackness is starting to look up in ways it was never meant to. Jumping down. Mbembe reminds us that, quote, neither Blackness nor race has ever been fixed. They have, on the contrary, always belonged to a chain of open-ended signifiers. These signifiers need to signify upon something or some way of being. Race and Blackness have historically and materially signified the political economy of difference, the ongoing reproduction of social class positions, and the biopolitical targets of certain forms of state violence. They're population level parameters that subject groups to vulnerabilities that allow for acceptable levels of violence, degradation, and or exploitation. Of course, when I say acceptable, I mean acceptable to the state and white supremacist publics. It is of concern when people ignore these uneven relational intentions of race in order to organize political projects where Black becomes the one and only generative subject position. Rather than explore the material and social conditions that harm Black people, these cultural formations merely seek to celebrate racial identity, think image awards or certain affinity groups. In these spaces, the production of Blackness is heralded as liberation in and of itself, absent any material, social, or political change. More problematically, there exists the exploitation, commercialization, and commodification of these spaces for profit. So I'll end there and turn it back over to you, Stefani.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. You know, I've had the pleasure of reading your chapter a few times, and there is something nice, especially nice to hear it read in your voice, to hear you read your words out loud. And so it added a different layer of it added a different layer of being able to engage with your ideas. So thank you so much for sharing. And now we'll move over to Sean. Sean Cameron Golden is a PhD candidate in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. There, he studies fugitivity and how Black educators subvert westernized schooling systems. Sean, please go ahead.
The chapter is called Becoming Storied: Impossible Storytelling as an Act of Fugitive Wake Work. And I believe this chapter has kind of it's been like a couple of years in the making. Maybe a couple decades, and just I hadn't had the power or knowledge to create the words to say what I needed to say. But growing up in Orange County in an all-white school system, I was the black sheep that stuck out. And I was always curious about why my peers treated me so differently. And then kind of in the constant question that would come up on the schoolyard was always like, where are you from? And why aren't you in Africa? And I was like, well, what is Blackness? And why does Blackness always associate with Africa? When I knew my personal family history and lineages came from the Caribbean. So this chapter was a work in like kind of restoring the narrative of a global Blackness, and we are beyond just what schooling systems have said Black people are from Africa, and that is all. And I did this in working through participatory action research, working with my mom and my aunties, and trying to understand a more personal story about my own like grandmother's diasporic journey from Jamaica to England to New York, and how I ended up on the Pacific Ocean. And later with multiple readings, I recognized what I was doing using participatory action research and how I was talking to my mother and my aunts was almost in a way a fugitive production. And that's where I'm going to start in my reading, is kind of in the middle, or not kind of, actually in the middle of my piece. And then I'm going to finish with the conclusion. So this section was called A Fugitive Production. We chart the impossible to honor and reclaim our lost histories. Impossible storytelling is a necessity to restore our relationship of being racialized. It's a story of movement because the Black diaspora is movement. Extended from fugitive theory, this storytelling exercise is a fugitive production attempting to find answers to the schoolyard microaggression, "Where are you from?" Displacement is the moving of someone from their former network of relations, describing the plight of Africans and their descendants during the violent time of stealing bodies from homes. But what word is there after the initial displacement, after the end of chattel slavery? What describes the feeling of being othered because you're Black, marginalized, not in the systems every day? I put forth misplacement, to put in a wrong or inappropriate place, as a term used to describe what and how Black people experience time in Western institutions built from an American episteme. I surround miss with parentheses as a herald to the fact that we had no agency. We were not in the room writing the laws. Western schooling's singular narrative racializes Black people as one-dimensional. Racialization happens because American systems misplace Black students before they have language to refuse its narrative. It is a relationship one slowly becomes aware of through the recognition of microaggressions and the everyday mundane violence inflicted on Black students. We are misplaced. To understand the phenomenon, to find where I am from, I became a fugitive. Fugitivity is about refusal and emancipatory transformation, central themes of Carter G. Woodson's campaign to subvert the American educational system. Impossible storytelling became a project to subvert my teachings of and about Blackness. Jarvis R. Given's fugitive pedagogy recounts ways in which Woodson campaigned to subvert curriculum to help racialized beings learn about themselves through alternative practices that broke free from words of white textbooks. Fugitivity enunciates subversive practices of Black social life in the African diaspora over and against the persistent violence of white supremacy and its technologies of surveillance and domination that were bound up in and animated by the chattel principle. The concept is not about the fugitive person, rather, fugitivity is inspired by what forced the person to become a fugitive, to seek and find self-actualization outside the American system. Fugitivity exists in the liminal spaces of academia, interdisciplinary study groups, side research projects, independent studies to sidewalk conversations, echoing the liminal spaces in which Blackness and Black education moves. Woodson approached education and learning as a social experiment. It wasn't that Tessie McGee was hiding Woodson's book from her principal, but he was helping her learn to practice hiding, to flee at a moment's notice in case the white superintendent interrupted her space. Impossible storytelling was my tool to escape. It illuminated a world I never thought existed. Forged was an understanding of misplacement as I cared for the afterlife of Doretta. Reflexive stories, reflexive storytelling. So this is the conclusion. The need to write myself from the oppressed other narrative was the impetus. The need to write myself from the oppressed other narrative was the impetus of impossible storytelling, releasing the constant tension of lostness. In the wake, the past that is not past reappears, always to rupture the present. I felt around for narrative fragments left in the wake, still bopping up over the crest. My blank past breached when asked questions about belonging, fending off microaggressions of soiled imaginations on the playground and classrooms. But the Black in me stood in front of this blank past. Guided by fugitive literacy practices, I used artifacts of Doretta's to bring her body back through story, a resurrection. Storytelling is a mode of embodied knowledge production. Blackness informs consciousness as we imagine ourselves from colonialist, imperialist, and capitalist terror. Forms of oppression are born and bred from Western constructions of knowledge that privilege the dualisms of mind and body. The Black body and imagination have always suffered from this duality, as we were, still are, known for our bodies and not our minds to work. Storytelling, in contrast, directly involves the body. It is done with the body. It implicates and liberates the body. My research was driven to stop feeling out of place. I loved literature, but the readings in Western classrooms didn't love me back. When the dark other was present, they were always a foreigner or placed in chains or crossing borders. Haunted on the playground, hallways, and classes, I was racialized as a foreigner without a homeland. The Black body bounced through cycles of violence inside the text, transferring these ideas into the imaginings of teachers and classmates. Misplaced through time and laws, I had no pen in writing. I sought a story that I could help illuminate my Blackness, so that was more than just a fragmented diasporic tale. Doretta's journal was the manual to help situate our family's travels through and along the diaspora. The concept of impossible storytelling was an idea born from frustration and sadness. It was exercising the numbness after hearing about Ahmaud Arbery's lynching. There was no confusion as to the hate that was present in his murder, but what did confuse me was that his story on TV now only started with death. Why do stories of Black folk always have to start with death and loss? This prompted my exploration into Doretta's life and my own Blackness. Through fugitivity and fugitive pedagogy, myself as a teacher and student, I've learned that Blackness is dynamically transient, amorphous, and fluid. Like water, Blackness is not contained by borders. Although education has been presumed the key to access power in the Western world, current modes of knowledge acquisition and production don't suit the needs of the Black fugitive in academia or K-12 education for that matter. To prioritize Blackness, we must let our children and educators research their Blackness and how it moves in the Black diaspora. Writing with Doretta Cameron gave the space and allowance I was looking for to become Black, as opposed to it being thrust upon me. As we navigate the waves and wake of Black life and education, we must privilege natural inclinations of fugitivity as we gather narrative fragments to begin the restoring process of Black experiences of the diaspora using impossible storytelling. I'm done.
Thank you, Sean. I do hope that for those who are watching this webinar, that you'll get to read both chapters in full, and to get to see what you're getting at with the restoring of Doretta Cameron's story, some of those journal entries, which are so beautiful. And so let's move now into a couple discussion questions. I will get us started with the first one, and maybe give you a chance to just catch your breath, Sean, and we'll get Brian to start us off. But these are some questions I'm sending out to both of you. So these questions are for both of you to answer. And the first one is, really, how do you think you would have reacted to your chapter if you had read it in the earlier years of your graduate training? And with that, who do you hope will read your chapter and why? I'll also put that in the chat so you can have it to reference. But yeah, what do you think your early impressions would have been a few years ago or earlier in your graduate training?
Yeah, this was a I actually really love this question because, I honestly think I would have been upset by my chapter. I think I reflect back in the chapter to a time and space where I was working with young people. I know the part that I read was kind of much more theoretical, but the chapter begins with me and sitting in these couches with a group of Black youth and thinking about participatory action research. And why I think I would have been upset by my chapter is that, I think one of the functions of racialization has always been to like obfuscate, right? And to like make race, and I think Sean kind of was speaking to this, like slippery and amorphous and hard to grasp onto. And I think what that ends up doing is sometimes it does get us caught in a space where a racial identity becomes what we can grasp onto because we get to form it, right? And we get to shape it. And so I think as I was, and still am, I'm still in spaces that are, definitely grasp onto to Blackness as a racial identity. And I'm not arguing that in and of itself is problematic, but I think what I am arguing is that alone is problematic, right? And so the chapter says that identity in and of itself is allows us to be susceptible to continued perpetuations of the harm that racialization engages in. And if we're not attuned to that harm, that we would that we will be continued, in some cases confused, but I'd say also wedded to political projects that do not serve the interest. And I'll really quickly pivot to that second part of the question, which is like, who am I speaking to? And I'm definitely speaking to like my own community. I'm definitely speaking to people who are engaged in somewhat radical educational justice organizing, and in a lot of ways speaking to folks who have taken on the baton of abolition. And I really love the ideas and questions that have been raised out of this abolitionist space. But I think it's important to remember, like, the abolitionists of the 18th and 19th century also had a parallel where racialism still was able to thrive with that form of kind of anti-slavery abolition. And I'm actually concerned that in our current state of like carceral abolition and how we're thinking about that we're also allowing racialism to continue to thrive within that. And racialism, again, in this like core essence belief in the project of race. And so part of what the audience I'm speaking to in this chapter are folks like me, folks who are in this work, who are I think very like susceptible to racialism as a destiny.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for touching on the earlier parts of your work, and throughout the chapter where you kind of are using it as a reflection back on the YPAR work you were doing at a particular time. And really at the end of the essay, you think about, okay, well, what does this mean for this work now? And how would I think about it now? What kind of conversations would I have been having with these young people, which I think is so important. I also think that part of what your chapter is really doing is really trying to disrupt our idea of these like taken for granted ideas. Like, how far will abolition take us if we're not really thinking about the abolition of these social hierarchies that set us up to have racialization? And so it's just so there's so much in there to pull on, and I think the audience that you're speaking to is exactly the audience that will want to take this up and should be thinking about this in their work, right? And I also love that you touched on this idea that it's not necessarily that this is not coming from a well-meaning place, right? Like, these people, it's not that this work isn't happening and it's not happening. It's always like being done in a bad way. It's like this is often happening in radical educational spaces, but what happens when that's not enough, or that's the only way we're framing Blackness?
Right.
And so now we'll move to Sean, again, just reflecting on earlier in your graduate training, how you may have felt about your chapter, thought about your chapter, and then also who are you writing this work for? Who's your audience?
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, like, since I read it, because it's a hard question to answer. I think, especially in my place, I'm still pretty like, I'm a baby. So I was like, I would have loved to have seen this in my first semester of graduate school versus like really getting into like positivism in the Vienna Club, and just like those sorts of like quantitative research methodologies. And I think like just recently I was at the LACMA at their Afro-diasporic exhibit going on, and they had this really beautiful room of like just Black portraitures. And I was reading about how Black portraitures often feature people in the everyday versus like portraitures from these Western worlds that feature these huge figures that have come to rule. And I was just thinking about these stories of Blackness and like really wanting to center like the everyday stories of like Blackness and Black people versus these like amazing stories like the Williams sisters, right? Like, we should talk about them, but what if we talked about like just the everyday lives of Black people within the academy and within research and education, and just what is it like to experiencing reading a book in which like somebody that looks like you is being hurt, and you're around people that don't look like you. So I guess I would have reacted to my chapter the way in which I wrote it, because it was my reaction. It really helped me enter into a space to move away from, like, what I was trying to move away from was just these like strict Western worlds of like research, and really get into theorists that like Sylvia Wynter, who's studying conceptions of man, and Christina Sharp, who's really looking at the wake, and even I was really messing with Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's The Dark Fantastic, and just how we approach like Black speculative fiction. And that's really where this stemmed from. So my reaction would have been like how I wrote it. Yeah. And with that, like, I don't know, I guess I want my mom to read it. That's kind of who I hope. And I think because this was such a strong like family story, I would love to see how my aunties and my mom would like read this work, and see if I captured their mother and my grandmother within all of her ferocity.
Yeah, and it's beautiful to hear that the audience that you have in mind is also the audience that you were working on these ideas with. Like you came to this story, this restoring with your mom and your aunties, and I think capturing the everydayness is something that is done so well in the kind of journal entries that you capture throughout a Cameron story. It's really not trying to like create necessarily a superhero, but an insistence that like this person had a life, and they had an everyday life, an ordinary life that you want to bring to light, want to capture. Part of the essence of this volume, or the overall volume that is really to try to think about what kind of training do we get as graduate students in education, and then maybe into our early careers in academia, and what are the other places we learn how to think or produce theory and research. And so your chapter models that so well, in the sense of you're saying like this is what I was seeing right as soon as I got into grad school, and this is how I decided to kind of do something different and try to think outside of these Western forms of theory that produce Black people in very limited and limiting ways. And so it's great that you're creating a chapter that you said that you needed. Like you're in real time, you're doing the thing that you wanted to read. So yeah, I think that's awesome. Let's move into the next question, which it carries on really well with this idea of storying and storytelling. So again, the edited volume as a full project, part of what we invited authors to do is to think about using first-person narratives and some of the learning curves around conceptualizing Blackness. And so I'm wondering if both of you, and we'll start here with Sean, could talk about the important connections between story and theory.
Yeah. I just like recently learned of narratology. So now I'm like nerding out about that. But within like, I was like in my brief reading, I was like, wow, like stories is super important because it informs like how we begin to see the world, and how we begin to see ourselves within the world. So and I would argue I grew up a storyteller. I grew up in a storytelling household. So just like that idea was always like so present in my life of telling stories and stories being important. And the connection is, I think they inform each other. And without it, we're just kind of gray blobs. Yeah, I think I don't know. Did I answer that right?
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to make sure that you were at a complete stop before I jumped in. Yeah, so we'll go to Brian now.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I haven't heard of narratology, so I'll be interested to hear more about that. But yeah, I think, and it is interesting, right? I think when people kind of juxtapose my piece and Sean's piece, they'll see that we kind of came at this purpose of the volume from very different ways, right? In terms of how even terms of how we tell story, and that there will be some contradictions, and that's like the intention of this chapter with the kind of like the impossibilities of understanding Blackness. And so for me, I think I try also to let theory be it's a story as well, right? And so, for instance, as I'm like engaged in this kind of work and delving into racial theory, I'm bringing in, I do this like work in like semiotic analysis where I pair Roland Barthes with Henry Louis Gates, and use like Henry Louis Gates as the signifying monkey to like help us understand how like signifying as like a Black rhetorical practice actually helps us kind of deconstruct signification as a semiotic technology, right? And so the story of, that the signifying monkey is literally a story, right? And I don't go back through and tell that story, but you could, right? Like you could understand what the work is that's trying to happen out of that. I think, like for instance, bringing in like, and the part that I read just now, thinking about Diggable Planets as a hip hop group and what they're trying to do in the mid 1990s through their music is telling a story. And yes, I like, kind of like, kind of abstract it to the realm of racial theory and trying to make sense of this thing that they put in their title of their song called the Blackitalism, right? And so, but the stories I think are embedded in my attempts to theorize. And so for me, I think theory and story, like, and it's kind of ending on the same point that Sean made, if they're not symbiotic, could also, almost be like one and the same in lots of ways.
Yeah, thank you. We're coming close to the end here, and so I wanted to, by way of closing, just have you both end off on a sentence or two, reflecting back on the title of the section. And the section title is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Illuminating ImPossibilities, im/impossibilities as it's written. And so I'm wondering what that means for you, but more specifically in a brief sentence or two, what possibilities or impossibilities does your chapter shed light on? And I'll give you a moment to maybe give it a little bit of thought, and then Brian, you can get us started, and then I'll have Sean, you go after.
Sure. And I'll try to be brief. I think, in my own work and thinking about what Blackness has entailed, it's contradiction in and of itself, right? And so this idea of like impossibility and possibility, it's the catch-22, right? It's the catch-22 of race and kind of like told through Blackness. And so, I think for me, just thinking about how my piece attempts to push us in a direction of racial abolition, but specifically through Blackness, right? So it's not, I'm not even going to address like colorblindness or anything like that. Like racial abolition has nothing to do with colorblindness, right? Racial abolition has to do with world making. And I, part of the work that I'm trying to do is to have us think through or not getting stuck in racialism as the end goal. And so I think that for me is like, I think speaks to this idea of like impossibility, possibility.
Yeah, I would continue off of what Brian said about world building. And I think a lot of like new Black theory right now is a production of world building, and like citational politics is like creating and building a new world. And I think in my chapter, I really tried to first like continue this like new introduction of like using fugitivity within academic spaces as ways out from the shadows and around like white ivory towers, to really like kind of reclaim and self-actualize yourself as like maybe not just a Black researcher or Black academic, but just like a Black person existing in this world, because we exist everywhere. And I think it goes back to just the idea of just the everyday person living and existing. And I was really kind of hit by Ahmaud Arbery, and then being from Minneapolis and watching the Black Spring of 2020, just how disruptive it was to like life, but also just how powerful a lot of like the work that was coming out of it was. Really was just, it was beautiful to be a part of it in a weird way. And I think I was just trying to, my chapter is just trying to contribute to that movement of like world building and remaking ourselves as human.
Wonderful. Thank you to you both. I mentioned already, but I do hope that folks who are able to watch this webinar are also able to read your chapters in full. It has been such a treat to me to be able to read your work. And if you're not able to, I hope that you enjoyed this webinar, and I hope that you're able to glean something from some of the ways that both of these scholars are thinking of Black theory and Black storytelling and all of that. So with that, we'll close out our conversation. Thank you so much, Brian and Sean, for being with me today and having this conversation, but also for your beautiful chapters in this book. And with that, unless either of you have something to say, I can close us out.
Just thank you for all of the work that you've been doing on this volume as well.
Yeah,
Great.
Thank you. Echoing what Brian says, thank you.
Thanks. All right, well, take care, and bye to everyone watching.